Moving on to the next scenario, as always, first thing we're doing before writing implementation for the test is we're checking what the function is actually doing. In this case, the function resetTimelineItemActivities takes a couple of arguments, first of which is array of timeline item objects, and the second argument is activity object. And then this function is going to iterate over timeline item objects of the array, which is passed as the first argument, and reset a couple of properties of these objects, such as activity ID as well as activity seconds. But only then if the current timeline item object is related to an activity passed as the second argument. Later on we're gonna take one more look at the implementation of this function, and now let's start writing test implementation. Since for this test we're going to need activity object to be passed as the second argument, we can copy over this object from another test and paste it in here. Actually, in this case it will be better if we're going to declare a couple of activity objects. I'm gonna call the first activity object training activity, and the second one will be called reading activity. And I'm also going to change values of all fields of the second activity objects to make them different. Besides these two objects, we're also going to need an array of timeline item objects. So I'm gonna create an array timeline items. In here, we have to add objects with 4 properties, what timeline item type requires. And I'm basically going to relate first timeline item object to training activity by assigning ID of this training activity to activity ID property like so. And then let's add a couple more timeline item objects in this array. The second object will also be related to training activity. Just to make these objects different, I'm going to change values of properties. And finally, the third timeline item object is going to be related to another activity, reading activity. So moving on to the second part of the test, where we're going to call the function we are testing, which is resetTimelineItemActivities function. And since this function requires 2 arguments to be passed, we're going to pass timeline items array as the first argument and training activity object as the second one. And just to fix this TypeScript error, let's just explicitly specify the type for timeline items constant. It contains array of timeline item objects. And now let's take one more look at the implementation of the function we are testing. So basically in here what we are doing is, firstly, we are filtering array of timeline item objects passed as the first argument, and keeping only those timeline item objects that are related to the activity object passed as the second argument. And then, in this loop, for each timeline item object which is related to the activity passed as the second argument, we're going to reset activity ID as well as activity seconds property. But we are resetting activity seconds property if current hour does not equal to the hour stored inside our property of timeline item object. Otherwise, we're basically going to reassign value of activity seconds property to itself, which means we're not doing anything. So in our particular case, since first 2 timeline item objects are related to the activity we're passing as the second argument, in this case we're going to reset activity ID properties of these objects and set it to null. And same goes with activity seconds property. But also we're going to mock the current time and set such time where the current hour will be equal to 2, which is the value stored inside of our property of the second timeline item object. In which case, activity seconds property of this object should not be restored back to 0. Alright, before getting to expectations, let's scroll up and create new date object, which is going to be used to mock the current date and time. In here we're calling setSystemTime, passing this date object to mock the current time. Of course, VI object has to be imported from the Vitest library. And also please note that for this object I have used 2 p.m., which is exactly an hour that we have assigned to the hour property of the second timeline item object. So down here let's write our expectation and check that timeline items array, which was passed as the first argument into resetTimelineItemActivities function, should be equal to another array. As a starting point, I'm going to copy over all these timeline item objects, paste them right here and change a couple of values that we expect to be reset. The first object is going to have a couple of properties reset, such as activity ID, as well as activity seconds. The second timeline item object is going to have activity ID property also reset, but activity seconds property should remain the same, because these timeline item objects corresponds to the current hour we have previously mocked. And the third timeline item object is not going to be modified at all, because it is related to a different activity than that we have passed to resetTimelineItemActivities function before. And just to make it extra clear that the second timeline item object corresponds to the current hour, I'm going to call the method getHours on the date object to extract the current hour of the current date. And the same thing I'm going to do right here, calling method getHours. But also to fix this TypeScript error, we have to explicitly cast this value to the hour type, like so. And this hour type is basically a union of 24 integer numbers from 0 to 23. So all these numbers correspond to valid hours. Let's also not forget that since we have mocked the current time, at the end of the test, we have to reset the time by calling useRealTimers method. And there we go, we're seeing that our test is passing. I'm going to switch back to the file with implementation of this function and comment out one property. In this case, the test is going to give us an error, because activity ID property, as we can see, was not reset. The same result we're about to get after commenting out the second property, activity seconds, and now activity seconds property is different. So we know that the test is checking the right thing. At the end, I'm going to remove modifier only to run all tests in the project. All of them are passing. Link to the source code of this lesson will be as always in the video description.